Hi good people, Titus here for another Unreal Engine tutorial, and in this video I'll show you how to create a simple game timer for your projects. Timers can be used for all sorts of things such as score multipliers, game over conditions, and so much more. So there's probably a pretty good chance you'll find yourself making one at some point. Alright, let's not waste any time and jump right into it. Alright, first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new folder, and we're just going to call it Blueprints. And I think starting off, we're going to create the user widget. So come to user interface, widget blueprint, choose user widget. I'm going to call it WBP underscore HUD. Then I'm going to open this up and dock it. And then for any widget, we usually start off with a canvas panel. And then I am actually going to use a horizontal box here, so I'll drag that in. And then for the horizontal box, I can come to anchors, and if you hold control, I'm going to click this top middle option here, so it kind of brings it to the middle. If I go back to anchors and this time I hold shift, it'll center it for me. And then I also want to add the size to content here. Now what I can do is come in and grab a text, but this time I'll drag the text into the horizontal box. And this text we are going to call minutes. This one is going to be a variable, so I'm going to check this box here. And then for the text type, I'm just going to add 2 zeros. And then I'm going to expand out the font and the outline settings. And I'm going to maybe bump this to a 48. And maybe I'll do 6 on the outline, just so it's a little bit bigger. Then we can come to the horizontal box, and I'm going to add a little bit of an offset, just to bring it down just a smidge here. Now, on the minute section, what I can do is I can right-click and duplicate it, and then change minutes to seconds. And then everything else is pretty much going to be the same. Now for the third text item, I'm going to drag this into the horizontal box. And this one is actually just going to be a semicolon. But I also want it to be size 48 and with an outline of 6. And you'll notice I want the dots to kind of be in the middle. So what you can do is you can grab your text, and you should have these little arrows. And you can click those and it'll actually reorganize your list. So it should display kind of like that. And then we got our basic HUD created. So we'll compile. We're going to go into the graph section on the top right. We'll find a blank space. And we're just going to make a quick custom event. And this custom event, I'm just going to call it a game timer. And then all we're really going to be doing is we're going to be dragging out the seconds. We'll do a get, and then we'll drag out the minutes, do another get, or you can hold control and drag it out. And then if you drag off these pins, you can do set text for both of them. And then we can hook these pins up like so. Now we need a way to pass in the seconds and the minutes from our function that we're going to be calling from our other blueprints. So the way we can do that is you can actually, on your custom event, just click it so it's highlighted, and then you'll see some input options at the bottom left here. So we can just hit the plus sign, and for the first one, I'll just call that seconds or SEC, and I'm just going to use an integer because these are going to be whole numbers. And then I'll add one in for the minutes, or MIN. And now I have these 2 little pins. Now the first node we're doing is seconds, so I can just pass in the seconds over here, and it brings up this wonderful function called toText, which we're going to come back to a little bit later. And then we could drag in the minutes. It'll pop in the same function. And then I can add a simple reroute node just to organize this a little bit better. And this pretty much completes the code here. And all this function does is it's basically passing the input we give to it into the HUD so it can update these little numbers here. That's all it is. We still have to write the code to actually, you know, create the timer, to actually increment or decrement or, you know, whatever you're doing with your timer. So for that, I am actually going to do that with a game mode. So I'm not going to select the game mode base. I'm actually going to come to all classes and do a search for game mode. And I'm going to select the game mode without the base. Call it BP game mode. And then I can open that up. Now there's some quick work we need to do before we write any code. The game mode state is going to just have some defaults. So the default pawn class, I want to make sure it's the third person character or whatever your project is using, first person, what have you. Make sure that's selected. And then in the world settings, if you don't have the world settings, you can come to the window and make sure world settings is checked. There is a game mode override. You'll want to make sure that's not the default project, which for this one is third person. I'm going to switch that to my BP game mode that I just created. And that's pretty much it for that, so we can actually start coding the graph. And the code's not too complicated, so off the begin play, we're going to create the widget we just made, which is the WBP underscore HUD. And then we can actually right click and promote this to a variable. And we can call it HUD ref, and that's just so we have a way to call it from other blueprints if we need to. And now we need to actually write the function for the timer. On the left hand side, you'll see there's a function section here. You just hit the plus sign, and you can call it whatever you want, game timer or stopwatch or whatever. The name is important to remember because you are going to have to basically call this exact function name from another part of the blueprint. So make sure whatever name you give it, you remember what it is. So the first thing we'll do here is we're going to increment some variables. So under the variable section here, we're going to create a seconds. And we're going to make this an integer. And then we're going to create another one for minutes. And we can just drag out and do a get, or if you hold control, it'll bring it out that way too. If you pull off this pin, I'm actually going to do an increasing timer. So I'm just going to do ++ and just choose the increment option here. Just a little bit cleaner. You can also just do, you know, addition and just add one, you know, whatever you prefer, I guess. And then we will need a branch node, so I can hold B, click into the graph, and it'll add a branch node. The condition I want to use is if the timer is equal to 60, or you can also use greater equal, that'd work too. And just, I'm going to do 60 here, plug this in there. And then once the timer reaches 60, or goes above 60, we'll mark true. And what I want it to do then is I want the seconds to equal 0, because I want to reset the counter. And then the other thing I want to do is I want to increase the minute count. So I can pull off this and do a ++, and that'll increase the minute count there. And then the final thing I need to do is I need to pass this information over into the HUD. Now, if you remember, in the graph section here, we created this custom event called game timer. So what I can do is I made a reference to our HUD in the event graph here. So because I made this reference, I now have this variable that I can use directly in my function. So I can pull this into here, do a get, and then the name of the function is game timer. So I can pull off this and do game timer. And there's the function there with the little arrow. And you'll notice I have my two input pins, which from here, I guess they would technically be output pins, but on this side, we created these input pins, so we can now feed them over here. So minutes will go into the minutes, seconds into the seconds here. And then we're basically going to do the same thing over here. So I'm going to do a control grab, call this into the game timer, because in the event that the seconds are not greater than 60, I still want it to update the timer, right? So even on the false pin, I'm going to go into the game timer, and I'm just going to drag the seconds into the seconds and the minutes into the minutes there. Now you're left with this basic function here. So there's not too much involved with it. It's pretty straightforward, but this is basically the code for the timer. So this is what's actually increasing our game timer that we're running from our Blueprint game mode. You could also write this code in your Blueprint character, or you could write it directly in the widget HUD. You can write it in the level blueprint. Doesn't really matter. I'll kind of talk more about that towards the closing part of this video on where you might want to put this code depending on what you're doing. But for now, we can compile, come outside the event graph. Now that's just a function. There's nothing inside that function that tells it to run at a particular interval, right? So we still need to set that up. There's a built-in Unreal function called setTimerByFunction. So set timer by, you can do event, but in this case, we're going to be using function name. And if you remember, I said to make note of whatever function name you use. In this case, I called it stopwatch. And then we could tell at what time interval do you want the function to run. So I want it to run every 1 second, and I want it to loop. And then if you wanted to, on the return value, you can right click, promote it to a variable. And now you have a game timer reference. And that's going to give you some flexibility to pause or unpause the timer. So like I can drag off this pin and do pause timer by handle. And I can drag off and do unpause timer by handle. And the way I would run these is I would create custom events called one pause timer. And then we can create another custom event. And you can call it unpause timer, or whatever you want to name it. But that's getting a little ahead of ourselves, so let's first compile and save this. Now, if we play the game as it is, nothing's gonna really happen, right? We're in the world, we're a third-person character, but we can't see the HUD. So we gotta actually get the HUD on the screen, and we do that from the actual third-person blueprint or whatever pawn blueprint you're using. Just open that up here, and I can pull into the begin play, come off at the end, and we'll do a cast. There's a few ways you can do this. This is the better way. You could technically add it to the off the create widget here. You can add it to the viewport, and that'll work fine for like this simple little prototype. But typically, if you're doing like a game timer for like a multiplayer game, and you have a game timer that you want to be, the same or synced across all clients, no matter what the latency or lag is, then you would want to do one timer in the game mode section, and then you would just cast out to all the clients and they just read that information, versus putting this code directly into the Blueprint pawn class that could have very different timers that are off by a few seconds from one another. Because it would start based on when the player joined the session. So that's where you'd probably run into some issues, is in like a multiplayer game. But if you're not doing a multiplayer game, then you honestly could probably put it anywhere. I don't think it's going to matter. But in the third person, I will cast to BP game mode. And then off the object, I can just do a get game mode. And now I have access to this little blue pin, and I can do get HUD reference. And then we can drag off this and do add to viewport. Off the success cast, hook that in there. And that's going to basically get me cooking with gas. So if I compile and play, you can see I have a timer, but it looks a little bit off. And if you remember, there was one other thing I wanted to show you, and that was back in the HUD. These functions are wonderful. You can actually expand them out, and there's a minimum and maximum digit length. You can actually set these to how many character sequences you want your timers to basically have. Compile and play, and now you notice your timer looks correct. And it'll basically increase from here. Once it reaches 60, it'll count over into the minutes and then reset the seconds, and then just kind of go from there. And the timer is very accurate. It does a pretty good job. I've seen some other tutorials where they're using event tick, and yeah, that works pretty good. That's going to be very frame dependent though. I guess a lot of this stuff is, but yeah, especially on event tick, if you have any sort of like, you know, large stuff going on the screen where the frame rate drops below 60, then your timer might be off a little bit. Versus this solution, which works a little bit better, and you only have one timer if you're doing multiple clients, so they all, even if the timer gets out of sync, at least it's still the same for all the clients reading it. So that's another advantage that you get from setting it this way in like a game mode versus coding it directly on a, you know, widget blueprint or the pawn blueprint or the level blueprint. Actually, the level blueprint would probably be fine too, depending on I guess your implementation. But the other thing I wanted to show you is in the your pawn class, what you can do is you can, I guess just for this simple example, we'll do a keyboard event. I'll create one for the 1 key, and then I'll create one for the 2 key, just to make it simple. And then off this little game mode, I can call into the pause timer, and then I can do the unpause timer, and then hook in the pressed for 2 and 1, compile, play. So now you can see the timer is increasing. If I hit 1, that pauses the timer, and then if I hit 2, it resumes the timer. So stuff where that would come into handy is if like you were doing like a game over state at a certain threshold, maybe you're counting down and you don't want the timer to keep going after it hits 0, or you know, what have you. I guess you can code that logic directly, or you know, depending on what you're looking to do. Then rather than destroying the timer and recreating it, or resetting it, you can just pause it and then pick it back up whenever you need to. So, but yeah. All right, everyone, we'll cut the video here to keep it short, but I hope you found some informative value in this topic that helps you in your own projects. But as always, thanks for watching, consider subscribing, and see you on the next one.